Alien girl tried to sell me her doll. She said she didn't need it anymore. Ethan walked with steady purpose through the glowing markets of Veyora Prime, his hand brushing against the satchel strapped across his shoulder. Inside were encrypted diplomatic documents, urgent and delicate, meant for the human embassy at the far end of the city. He had been told in strict and measured words that nothing could delay his mission. Every step he took carried the weight of responsibility, and every breath reminded him of the importance of duty. The market around him shimmered with colors unlike anything Earth could ever imagine. Crystal lanterns hung from silk-wrapped poles, glowing with hues of azure and gold. Traders with elongated necks called out their wares in voices that rang like chimes. Stalls overflowed with spiced fruit that smoked gently in the cool air, fabrics that changed color when touched, and trinkets carved from luminous stone. It was a city of marvels, but Ethan's eyes barely registered any of it. His focus was sharp, his mind locked on the task. The embassy awaited, and he could not falter. That was when he felt it. A tug at his sleeve. Quick, unexpected. His instincts flared. The markets of Veyora Prime were notorious for thieves, and his first thought was that someone had reached for the satchel. He turned sharply, his hand brushing against the clasp to ensure it was sealed. His gaze dropped, ready to confront a pickpocket. But what he saw was no thief. A little girl stood before him. She was alien, yes, but young in a way that transcended species. Her skin was pale with a faint shimmer, almost like moonlight made flesh. Her silver-gray eyes, wide and trembling, locked onto his with a desperate plea. She wore a ceremonial gown, once fine but now frayed and torn at the edges. It hung awkwardly on her small frame, and the fabric bore stains of dust and time. Her hands shook as she held something out to him. A doll. Not an ordinary doll, but one of crystal. Its surface was cracked, the once smooth figure splintered as though it had survived a fall. A faint inner glow flickered inside it, like the last ember of a dying flame. Ethan's breath caught. He had studied the culture of Veyora, and he knew at once what this was. That doll was no child's toy. It was a funerary relic, sacred to the Veyoran people, a vessel often placed beside the dead to guide them through the passage of eternity. "Buy it," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the market. Ethan froze. The request itself made no sense. No one sold such relics. They were too important, too sacred. Her eyes glistened as she spoke again, her words fragile, almost breaking apart. "I do not need it anymore. My sister will not wake up." The market around him carried on, oblivious to the crack that had just opened in his path. Merchants shouted, children laughed, travelers haggled over prices. But in that instant, the world seemed to narrow to the trembling child before him, and the broken doll she offered like a burden she could not carry. Ethan's first thought was duty, his mission. The satchel of documents pressed against his side like a reminder carved in steel. He had no time to stray, no right to intervene. His orders were clear: deliver the documents without delay. Yet the image of the girl held him fast. Her gown torn, her hands shaking, her eyes filled not with mischief but with grief that seemed far too heavy for one so small. That single line, "My sister will not wake up," lodged itself into him, heavy as iron. He could ignore her. He could turn away, quicken his pace, and tell himself that someone else would help. He could keep his mission safe and his conscience intact. But his feet would not move. His heart would not let him. "Where is your mother?" Ethan asked softly. The girl looked over her shoulder, toward the darker streets beyond the market. Streets where the glow of crystal lanterns faded and the polished stones gave way to cracked pathways. She said nothing. She only looked, and that was enough. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He knew where those paths led. The Vale District, a place whispered about in embassy halls, spoken of as a shadow to avoid. It was the quarter where the poor and unwanted lived, where the ruling caste turned their faces away. Humans were warned not to go there. It was a place of silence and invisibility. Still, the girl's gaze beckoned him, silent but commanding. He looked down once more at the doll she held, the cracks glinting faintly in the market light. Something inside him shifted, the balance between duty and humanity tipping dangerously. He had been taught that diplomats must remain detached, that compassion was a luxury reserved for times of peace. But at that moment, Ethan was no longer thinking like a diplomat. He was thinking like a man who had just looked into the eyes of a child asking for help. His fingers brushed the satchel once more, as though to remind himself of the choice before him. Then he exhaled slowly. "Show me," he said. The girl's eyes widened, a flicker of hope breaking through the fog of sorrow. She turned quickly, slipping into the narrow path that led away from the market's glow. Ethan followed, the hum of trade and laughter fading behind him, replaced by a silence that grew heavier with each step. And with every stride, he knew he was walking away from orders and into something else entirely. The girl moved quickly, darting between narrow alleys that grew darker with every turn. Ethan followed close behind, his senses sharpening. The polished brilliance of the market seemed like a distant dream now. Here, the light of crystal lanterns grew sparse, their glow weak and flickering as though even the lamps were reluctant to remain. The air carried a damp chill, and the vibrant sense of spice and fruit gave way to the acrid tang of smoke and decay. This was the Vale district. Ethan had heard whispers about it in embassy briefings, always spoken with an air of dismissal. It was described as a place where law held no sway, where the ruling caste allowed silence and shadow to swallow lives that did not matter. He had not expected to ever see it with his own eyes. As he followed the girl deeper, shapes began to emerge from the gloom. Children, thin and barefoot, huddled in doorways of broken stone. Their eyes, large and silver-gray like the girl's, watched him with quiet suspicion. Some clutched pieces of cloth against their shoulders, others held nothing at all. No laughter echoed here, no voices sang out. It was a quarter of silence, of people stripped of even the will to speak. Ethan's jaw tightened. These were not ghosts. These were living children, abandoned by the city that glittered so brightly only streets away. The girl did not slow until she reached a building half-collapsed on one side, its frame leaning as though weary of standing. She slipped through a gap in the doorway and glanced back at him with a silent plea. Ethan followed, ducking into the shadows within. The room was dim, lit only by the weak light of a single crystal shard set in a cracked stand. Dust hung in the air, and in the corner, beneath a threadbare cloth, lay a shape small and still. Ethan's breath caught in his chest. He knew without being told. The girl walked toward the shape and knelt, her small hand resting on the covered form. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing more. A sound stirred behind Ethan. He turned sharply. A woman emerged from the shadows, tall, graceful even in her weariness. Her long brown hair cascaded like silk, though it had lost its luster. Her ceremonial dress, once fine, bore frayed edges and faded embroidery. Yet none of that diminished her presence. She carried herself with dignity that hardship could not erase. Her silver-gray eyes met his, the same eyes as the girl's, but filled with something deeper: sorrow, strength, and a quiet fire that had not been extinguished, no matter how hard life had pressed against her. "You should not be here," she said, her voice low but steady. Ethan held her gaze. "Your daughter brought me." The woman's eyes softened as she glanced at the child, who still knelt by the covered form. She moved closer, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Then she looked back at Ethan, her voice carrying a weight that made the dim room feel heavier still. "She has not accepted it yet. None of us do. Her sister is gone. But the priests—" Her words trailed, bitterness coiling in her throat. She steadied herself and continued. "The priests say she is unworthy of the rites. They say the poor have no place among the stars." The words struck Ethan harder than he expected. He had studied Veyoran traditions, their funerary rites tied to crystal relics meant to guide the spirit into eternity. To deny such rites was not just cruelty. It was erasure. The woman lifted her chin, her sorrow sharpening into quiet rage. "We are invisible to them. Even in death they erase us." The child pressed herself closer against her mother's side, clutching the cracked crystal doll as if it were the only anchor she had left. Ethan felt the weight of his satchel again, the encrypted documents digging into his shoulder. He should not have been here. Every second he lingered risked his mission, risked the trust of those who had sent him. Yet his heart burned with something that refused to let him walk away. He looked once more at the still form beneath the cloth. A child denied peace. Family denied dignity. A community denied even recognition. "What is your name?" he asked softly. The woman studied him for a long moment, as if measuring the worth of the question. At last she answered, "Mira." The name lingered in the air like a chord of music, both strong and fragile. "Mira," Ethan repeated, his voice steady. "Your daughter deserves peace. No one should deny her that." Her eyes searched his, wary and searching. "And what will you do, human diplomat? The priests mock even our pleas. They call us shadows, not people. You risk nothing by leaving, but you risk everything by staying." Ethan looked down at the cracked doll, its faint glow flickering in the girl's trembling hands. He thought of the orders in his satchel. He thought of the embassy waiting. He thought of his oath to serve with honor. And yet, when he raised his eyes again, his decision was already made. "Then I will risk everything," he said. For the first time, Myra's expression faltered. Behind her sorrow, behind her fire, a flicker of something else appeared. Hope. The girl lifted her eyes to him, wide and glistening, as though she could not believe what she had heard. Her small voice cracked the silence. "Will you really help us?" Ethan knelt, his eyes level with hers. "Yes, I will." The child clutched the doll tighter, her lips trembling as though holding back a sob. Myra's hand lingered on her daughter's shoulder, her gaze fixed on Ethan with an intensity that burned into him. The air in the room seemed to shift. The silence was still there, but it was no longer the silence of despair. It was the silence before a storm. Ethan straightened, his decision sealed. He would not carry the girl's grief back into the shadows. He would carry it into the light, and that meant walking straight to the heart of the city, to the Crystal Gate itself. The Crystal Gate rose high above the city like a monument carved for the gods themselves. Its towering spires shimmered in hues of violet and gold, each crystal shard catching the light of Veyora's twin suns. Pilgrims and citizens walked its marble steps in solemn lines, carrying offerings wrapped in cloth of silver and green. The air was thick with incense, the smoke curling in delicate trails that seemed to vanish into the heavens. Ethan had seen the temple once before from a distance, but never like this. Now he stood at its threshold, carrying nothing but the weight of a promise he had made in a forgotten quarter of the city. At his side walked Mira, her worn ceremonial dress fluttering faintly in the wind, and her daughter who clutched the cracked doll close to her chest. Their presence drew stares. People stepped aside, not out of courtesy but out of unease. The poor of the Vale district did not belong at the Crystal Gate. Their lives were hidden away, their deaths ignored. Yet here they were, climbing the steps toward the priests who ruled with indifference. At the top of the stairs, a circle of priests waited. Their robes gleamed with golden thread, their crowns heavy with polished gems. Their faces were carved masks of superiority, their silver-gray eyes colder than stone. One of them raised a hand, halting Ethan and the others before they could cross the threshold. "This gate is not for you," the priest said, his voice sharp and echoing. His gaze shifted to Mira and her child. "You know the law. The unworthy do not receive the rights." Mira stood tall, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder. Her voice trembled, but not with fear. "My child lived. She breathed the same air as you. She laughed and played beneath the same suns. And now she is gone. Do not tell me she is unworthy." The priest's lip curled in disdain. "You shame yourself, Mira. And you, human." His gaze snapped to Ethan, filled with contempt. "You meddle in matters beyond you. This is not your fight. Return to your embassy before you are cast out." A ripple of murmurs stirred among the citizens who had gathered near the steps, curious about the confrontation. Their whispers grew louder as more stopped to watch. The sight of a human diplomat standing beside the forgotten poor was not something the city had ever witnessed. Ethan's heart pounded, but his voice was steady. I know your laws. I have studied them. And I know this. Every child of Veyora, no matter their station, is entitled to burial among the stars. The priests stiffened, their cold confidence cracking for the first time. One of them sneered. You twist words from forgotten history. That law is dust. It does not bind us. Ethan took a step closer, his voice rising just enough for the crowd to hear. It binds you still. You call yourselves guardians of tradition, yet you would deny the very heart of it. You wear crowns of crystal, but you spit on the spirit that gives them meaning. The crowd stirred again, louder this time. People leaned forward, whispering, eyes fixed on the unfolding standoff. The priests exchanged uneasy glances. The last thing they wanted was public doubt. Another priest, older than the rest, stepped forward. His eyes narrowed. You risk much, human. Your embassy will not shield you from exile if you defy us. Do you truly wish to throw away your place here for a nameless child? Ethan's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of his satchel pressing against him, the documents inside as heavy as stone. His mission had been clear, his orders precise. But now, standing before the crystal gate, with Mira at his side and her daughter clutching that broken doll, there was no hesitation left in him. He raised his voice, letting it carry to the crowd. This child is not nameless. She was a daughter, a sister, a soul of Veyora. And if you deny her the rights, then you do not serve the stars, you only serve yourselves. Myra's eyes widened. For a moment, her hand brushed against his, a fleeting touch that carried more strength than words could give. The priests bristled, their authority challenged openly. One of them hissed, Enough! You will leave now, or you will be silenced. But the crowd was no longer silent. Voices rose from the steps, low at first, then stronger. He speaks truth, someone said. The law is for all. Others joined in, their voices carrying weight the priests could not ignore. The priests faltered. Their threat hung in the air, but their power wavered under the gaze of their own people. They had not expected defiance. They had not expected a human diplomat to stand before them, invoking their own sacred history. And they had not expected Mira, tall and unyielding, to stand in plain sight with grief burning in her eyes. Ethan did not move. He stood tall, his voice final. Honor the child, or you will be remembered not as guardians, but as thieves who stole peace from the dead. The silence that followed was heavy. The priests' faces twisted with fury, but the tide had turned. The law, the crowd, and the sheer force of defiance left them no ground to stand on. At last, the oldest priest lowered his gaze, his voice thin with anger. Very well, the rites will be performed. But know this, human, you have made enemies in high places. Ethan's jaw tightened. He did not care. The only thing that mattered was the promise he had made. Mira closed her eyes briefly, her shoulders trembling as relief washed through her. The little girl clutched the doll tighter, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The gates of the temple opened. The bells rang, their sound echoing across the city. And for the first time in decades, a child of the Vale district was carried into the sacred light, her name spoken, her spirit honored. Ethan followed, knowing the battle was not yet over. But for that moment he had won. The bells of the crystal gate tolled, deep and resonant, each note echoing like thunder through the city. The sound drew more citizens from the markets and the surrounding districts, their eyes wide with disbelief as they realized what was happening. For generations, no child of the Vale district had been granted passage through the sacred gates. Yet now, under the twin suns of Veyora, the forgotten poor walked where they had long been forbidden. The priests led the way, their jeweled robes glimmering in the glow of the temple spires. Their movements were stiff, their expressions carved from stone, but they could not halt what they themselves had been forced to begin. Behind them came Mira, her steps steady though her heart trembled. She carried the small, still form of her daughter, wrapped in the ceremonial cloth that had waited far too long to be used. Ethan walked beside her, each step deliberate, his presence a shield against the venomous stares of the priests. His mind raced with the knowledge of what he had done, defied authority, risked his mission, and openly challenged those who held the city's power. Yet not once did he waver. Every glance at Myra's silver-gray eyes, every glimpse of the little girl clutching the cracked doll, reminded him that some battles were worth the cost. The temple's inner chamber glowed with crystalline light, refracted through towering spires that pierced the sky. Incense drifted through the air, filling the vast hall with the scent of burning resin. Here, the sacred rites would be performed, rites that countless souls had been granted before, but never one from the Vale district. The priests began the chants, their voices rising and falling in practiced rhythm. The words spoke of journeys to the stars, of spirits carried beyond the veil of life into eternal light. Though their tones were hollow, the ritual itself carried power, and the crowd that had gathered outside pressed closer to witness it. Mira laid her daughter gently upon the altar of crystal, her hands trembling as she stepped back. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she bowed her head, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Ethan stood close enough to steady her if she faltered, his gaze never leaving the small form upon the altar. He did not know the prayers of Veyora, but in his heart he spoke his own, that this child, denied so much in life, would now be given the peace she had been robbed of in death. The chants rose higher, the crystals glowing brighter with each verse. The chamber filled with a brilliance that seemed to wash away the shadows clinging to the girl's still form. And when the final words were spoken, the light flared once more, then faded to a soft, enduring glow. The rite was complete. A hush fell over the hall. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then Myra's knees gave way, and she sank to the floor, her hands covering her face as sobs racked her body. Not loud, not wailing, but the quiet sobs of a woman who had carried grief for too long and now, at last, could release it. The little girl who had first tugged Ethan's sleeve pressed close to her mother, tears streaming silently down her own cheeks. Then, as if remembering something, she turned to Ethan. With trembling fingers, she held out the cracked crystal doll. "You carry her now," she whispered. Ethan looked at the doll, its fractured glow faint but steady. Slowly, reverently, he took it into his hands. The crystal felt cold, but within it pulsed something faint, like a heartbeat from another world. He closed his fingers around it, his voice low but firm. "I will carry her," he said. Mira lifted her head at those words. Her eyes, red with tears, met his, and in that gaze, Ethan saw not only grief, but gratitude. And beneath that, something deeper still, a spark of trust, of connection, fragile yet unbroken. When they stepped out of the temple, the crowd waiting beyond the gates erupted in murmurs. Many bowed their heads in respect. Others whispered in awe. The poor of the Vale district, who had trailed behind quietly, now stood taller, their faces alight with something they had not felt in years: recognition. For once, they were not invisible. The priests remained behind, their anger barely concealed, but they had been forced into silence by the tide of public will. Their power had been challenged, and though they would not forget, neither would the people forget what they had witnessed. As the sun dipped lower and the temple spires glowed with the fire of dusk, Ethan walked beside Mira and her daughter through the streets. The cracked doll was still in his hands, its faint light guiding his steps. Around them, children of the Vale district trailed with cautious hope, their eyes lifted toward the sky as though the stars themselves had opened for them. That night, within the quiet of the embassy quarters, Ethan laid the doll upon his desk. He stared at its fractured glow for a long time, his thoughts heavy. He had risked everything, his mission, his standing, perhaps even his future in the city. Yet when he thought of Myra's bowed head, her whispered sobs, and the child's soft words, he felt no regret. Some duties were written in orders and sealed with wax. Others were written in the eyes of those who had been forgotten. He had chosen the latter, and he knew he would choose it again. In the Vale district, Mira sat with her daughter in their small, crumbling home. The air felt lighter, though the shadows of hardship still clung to the walls. For the first time since her child's death, Mira allowed herself to breathe without pain crushing her chest. She thought of the human diplomat who had stood beside her, defiant against the priests, unyielding in the face of power. She thought of the way he had said, "I will carry her," and for the first time in many years, Mira whispered to herself a single word she had long forgotten: hope. The days following the funeral passed with a quietness that felt almost unreal. The Vale district was never silent. There were always the sounds of clanging tools, market cries, and the restless stirrings of a people forced to live in scarcity. But now, layered beneath those noises, there lingered something new, a whisper of pride, a murmur of defiance. Word of the funeral had spread farther than the priests had wanted, and the people who had once lowered their heads now lifted their chins just a little higher. For Mira, life did not suddenly become easier. Her grief remained heavy and raw, yet it was no longer a private burden. The district around her seemed to share in her loss, and in doing so, lightened the weight she carried. And though she tried to return to her work quietly, her path soon crossed once again with the human who had dared to stand beside her. It was at the market 3 days later. Mira had gone to barter for grain, her daughter trailing close behind, still clutching a small scrap of fabric from her sister's old shawl. The stalls were crowded, voices raised as merchants fought to be heard. Mira tried to keep her head down, to move swiftly, but then a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Mira!" She froze. Her hands tightened on the basket she carried. Slowly she turned, and there he was, Ethan, dressed not in the formal robes of diplomacy, but in plain travel wear, his cloak dusted with the dirt of the streets. Yet his posture was the same, straight, steady, his presence filling the space around him like a pillar holding up the sky. Her heart stumbled in her chest, uncertain whether to race forward or retreat. "You should not be here," she said softly, her voice carrying both warning and worry. "The priests already hate you for what you did. If they see you among us, let them see." Ethan interrupted gently. "They already know where I stand. Hiding from them will change nothing." Mira looked at him, torn between fear and something else, something warmer. Her daughter tugged at her sleeve, whispering in awe, "Mama, he came back." Ethan knelt slightly so that he was closer to the little girl's height. His stern features softened as he said, "Of course I came back. I said I would carry her. That means I will carry both of you now." The child's eyes widened, shining with something Mira had not seen in them for a long time: trust. Mira felt her throat tighten. She wanted to push him away, to warn him that his presence put them both in danger. But she also wanted to believe those words, to believe that someone, anyone, could stand by her without turning away when the shadows grew too heavy. Against her will, she whispered, "Why? Why risk so much for us?" Ethan rose again, his gaze steady as it met hers. "Because your daughter deserved dignity, because you deserved to be seen, and because I could not forget the look in your eyes when you laid her down upon that altar." Mira swallowed hard, her chest aching. She did not know what answer to give, so she turned back to the stall, fumbling with her basket. Yet even as she bartered with the merchant, she felt Ethan's presence at her side, like a wall against the world. In the days that followed, he came often. At first, it was only small visits, helping her repair the cracked door of her home, carrying water when the pumps broke, sharing food from the embassy kitchens. The people of the Vale district watched with curiosity, some with suspicion, but slowly, their eyes softened. The human diplomat was not just a stranger meddling in their affairs. He was a man who carried buckets, who mended broken tools, who knelt in the dust beside their children and listened to their laughter. For Mira, each visit pulled her deeper into conflict with herself. She had learned long ago not to lean on anyone, not to hope for rescue. Yet now, every time Ethan's hand brushed hers while passing a tool, or when his voice carried across the market calling her name, her heart betrayed her. One evening, as the suns dipped low and painted the district in shades of crimson and gold, Ethan lingered at her doorway. Mira stood with her daughter, the light spilling over them like a painting. The cracked doll rested on the table inside, its faint glow a reminder of what they had lost and what they had gained. "I should go," Ethan said, though his voice carried no strength in the words. Mira looked at him, her lips pressing together. Then, quietly, she asked, "Why do you stay so long? Why do you not return to your world, to your duties?" Ethan's eyes darkened, as though he carried a weight too heavy to name. He stepped closer, his voice low. "Because when I am here, I remember why duty matters. Not the kind written in orders, not the kind spoken by priests or officials, but the kind written in faces like yours. The kind that reminds me what it means to be human." Myra's breath caught. She wanted to step back, but instead she found herself stepping closer. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the distance between them shrinking, the air heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Ethan said, almost in a whisper, "Mira, I do not want to just carry your sorrow. I want to share your life." Her chest trembled, her heart racing so fast it felt as if it might break free. For years, her world had been only grief, survival, and silence. Now, standing before this human who had defied the priests and held her hand in the dust, she felt something she had not dared to feel. Hope, and beyond that, something dangerously close to love. She did not answer with words. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers curled against his, hesitant at first, then firm. Ethan's hand tightened around hers, steady and sure. Above them, the twin suns slipped below the horizon, leaving the district bathed in starlight. For the first time in a long time, Mira did not fear the dark, because she was not standing in it alone. The weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of Ethan's life changed in ways he had never imagined. Once, his days had been consumed by orders, encrypted documents, and long sessions inside the polished halls of the human embassy. Now, his steps carried him through the narrow streets of the Vale district just as often as they did through marble corridors. He became a bridge between two worlds, his presence a reminder that duty could be more than obedience. It could be compassion. The people of the district grew used to seeing him. Children no longer scattered when he approached. Instead, they ran toward him, tugging at his cloak, laughing when he lifted them high into the air. Elders greeted him with nods of respect, their eyes holding both gratitude and quiet disbelief. To them, Ethan was proof that someone had finally looked past their invisibility and seen them as people, not shadows. But it was Mira who changed him the most. In her, Ethan discovered a strength that no speech or law could ever match. She was not a leader by title, but by presence. Her dignity in the face of hardship, her calm when others faltered, her ability to laugh softly even when tears were near. These were qualities that bound him to her in ways deeper than words. What had begun as obligation transformed into admiration, and admiration blossomed into something stronger, something unshakable. Still, their closeness did not go unnoticed. Whispers began to ripple through both human and Veyoran circles. Some embassy officials muttered that Ethan had compromised his position. Others hinted that he had lost perspective, becoming entangled in lives that were not his responsibility. Among the priests, anger simmered, their pride wounded by his defiance and his continued visits to the district. One evening, a fellow diplomat warned him plainly, "You tread a dangerous path, Ethan. The council tolerates your sympathies for now, but love for a Veyoran widow? That will not be so easily overlooked." Ethan listened, but his resolve did not waver. He had already chosen where his loyalty lay, even if he could not yet admit it aloud. It was Mira who voiced the question first. One night, beneath the twin moons that bathed the district in silver light, she asked quietly, "How long before your world demands you leave ours?" Ethan looked at her, the glow of the moons reflecting in her silver-gray eyes. He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing against the faint scars time had etched there. "My world can demand what it likes," he said firmly, "but I will not leave you." Her breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. She searched his face for hesitation, for doubt, but found none. Only steady, unwavering truth. And in that moment, she allowed herself to believe. Their bond deepened with each passing day. Laughter returned to Myra's home, tentative at first, then brighter, fuller. Her daughter, once so quiet, began to smile again. She played with the cracked crystal doll less often, leaving it on the shelf where the light from the window caught its fractured surface, turning it into a small beacon of memory. The district itself began to stir with new life. Inspired by Ethan's defiance and Myra's quiet strength, people began to speak out more, to demand fair treatment, to gather together not in silence but in solidarity. It was not revolution, not yet, but it was change. A seed planted, growing in the cracks of a system that had long denied them. And then came the day of their union. The ceremony was simple, but its meaning stretched far beyond the walls that held it. Beneath the twin moons of Veyora, surrounded by both human envoys and Veran citizens, Ethan and Mira stood side by side. She wore a gown repaired with careful stitches, the fabric carrying both history and hope. He wore the formal attire of his post, though his heart beat not for duty but for love. When their hands were joined, when vows were spoken in both human and Veran tongues, the crowd fell into a silence so profound it felt as though even the stars leaned closer to listen. The widow who had once been invisible was now honored before all. The diplomat who had once walked alone now bound himself to a family. Myra's daughter clung to Ethan's side, her small fingers curling into his hand as if to claim him as her own. And he held her close, his heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. She was no longer a child offering him a broken relic of grief. She was his daughter now, and he would carry her always. With the embassy's blessing, Ethan moved Mira and her child into the house assigned to him within the embassy grounds. It was not grand by human standards, but to Mira it was a palace compared to the crumbling walls of the Vale district. The floors shone with polished stone. The windows opened to gardens where flowers bloomed in colors she had never seen. For the first time, her daughter had a bed of her own, a space safe from hunger and fear. Yet the house became more than a dwelling. It became a symbol. For the people of the Vale district, it was proof that hope was not a dream too far. For the human embassy, it was evidence that bridges could be built not just with words but with lives lived together. For Ethan and Mira it was a sanctuary, a place where grief gave way to laughter, where two souls from different worlds built something stronger than either had known alone. As time passed, challenges continued. The priest still muttered, politicians still questioned, and shadows of the past lingered in Myra's heart. But whenever fear threatened to return, she would look to Ethan, his steady hand, his unwavering gaze, and remember that she no longer faced the stars alone. Ethan, too, found new strength in the family he had chosen. His mission as a diplomat did not end, but it was no longer his only purpose. Every decision, every risk, every step into the unknown now carried the weight of love. And so, beneath the twin moons of Veyora, with a cracked crystal doll resting on a shelf as both memory and blessing, a new story began. Ethan had come to Veyora as a man bound by orders, but he stayed as a husband, a father, and a protector. And together, with Mira at his side and her daughter in his arms, he was ready to face whatever the galaxy would bring. Because love, once born in grief, had grown strong enough to bridge two worlds. And that love would not break.